Hello, you're watching World Talks. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Since Friday and continuing over 2 days, Barcelona has been hosting a gathering of progressive leaders from across Europe, Latin America and Africa, including Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa and Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum, at the invitation of Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, for a summit focused on defending democracy and strengthening multilateral cooperation. The meetings come amid rising global polarization, the Iran war, and mounting strain on international institutions. Against this backdrop, the discussions are testing whether coordinated middle powers can respond more effectively to geopolitical instability and democratic backsliding. We speak now with Teivo Teivainen, professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Hello, wonderful to be here.
So let's start with the aim. I mean, the idea here is it's gathering a lot of very high-profile progressive left leaders in Barcelona. Now, tell us what you think the aim here is, and will they, at the end of this, have some kind of result?
Well, internationally, the aim is to find ways for transnational and international collaboration between social democratic, socialist, center-left leaders, facing what they see as the threat of nationalist right-wing parties and, of course, Donald Trump. All of them, and including Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, have also domestic political aims. His way of making himself seem one of the key European progressive leaders that's facing Trump helps him in domestic politics, where he's been under all kinds of fire recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned President Trump there, and I think that's one of these common threads a lot of these leaders have in common. I mean, Brazilian President da Silva, if you look at Pedro Sánchez, and South Africa's president, they've all been threatened in some way by Donald Trump in some measure. Now, Lula has said this is not an anti-Trump summit, but how is Trump in the mix here anyway? How do you see it?
They try to avoid mentioning him too much, and also in terms of their home turf, their domestic politics, the situation changes. For Pedro Sánchez in Spain, it's widely understood he's benefited from confrontational stance towards Donald Trump, whereas, for example, in Mexico, where President Claudia Sheinbaum is also in the meeting, the situation is more complicated because of the long border with the United States. So I imagine some leaders would like to take a more aggressive stance towards Trump, including Pedro Sánchez, and others like Claudia Sheinbaum want to avoid confrontational strategy.
Mm-hmm. And also an interesting line there when the Brazilian president was speaking to Sánchez, telling him directly that he understands when you say no to war. I mean, we know that Sánchez has been very much an outspoken critic of what the Americans are doing in Iran. So looking at something like that and talking about this sort of summit, what kind of, let's say, messaging will that send? I mean, Trump will hear about this one way or the other. What kind of message does that send to the Americans?
Well, I think the American government will be analyzing closely to what extent some kind of center-left front internationally and transnationally could emerge that could encourage also others in Europe to take a more bold stand vis-a-vis Trump in cases like attacking in Iran or in the Greenland case. And Pedro Sánchez has been clearly figuring as leader like that, but he's been somewhat alone also because in countries like Poland and Finland, many of the leaders are a little bit worried about what they see as insufficient commitment of Pedro Sánchez to common defense of NATO in Europe, and especially his refusal to take up the 5% military budget increase promise.
And how does this all fit, Teivo, in terms of the European dynamics? I mean, if we look at the socialists, the left in Europe, they're not doing so well in many countries. If I'm just thinking of Germany recently, the socialists there very much on the downward trend. Pedro Sánchez, is he an outlier? Do you see this sort of galvanizing more of progressive left in Europe? How does this all factor in? Because many of those leaders and high-level people, they are actually from South America and elsewhere.
Yes, certainly that's what he aims at. And as you say, in Germany, perhaps in France, also in the UK, right-wing and nationalist right-wing forces having very strong results in opinion polls. Of course, in some other countries, like here in Finland, Social Democratic Party in opposition now is clearly leading their opinion polls. But overall, there's not a good wind for social democratic and progressive forces in the world. In Latin America, likewise, in many countries, there have been right-wing victories. So for Gustavo Petro, for President Lula, for Claudia Sheinbaum, who are participating there, this is a possibility to find some space for networking within their own regions where right-wing forces have taken over in several countries, most recently perhaps in Peru, at least, if the election results turn out that way.
And also this idea of middle powers, we've heard that before. We've heard it from the Canadian Prime Minister. We've heard it also to some extent from the Polish Prime Minister as well. This, again, we're hearing this. So how does this fit into this? I mean, is it the same kind of, let's say, message of what middle powers can do? Is it a different kind of middle powers if we're looking at who's present here?
Well, this is clearly a more center-left middle powers compared to, when the Canadian Prime Minister meets with some others, most recently with Finnish President. And one could compare this also to something like BRICS, because you have a couple of prominent BRICS countries, leaders of South Africa and Brazil there. Then again, from India, you have opposition leaders from the Congress Party that are present there. So their composition is different from various other movements where you have so-called middle powers, a term perhaps a little bit overused in recent times, present. But yes, certainly, it's an attempt to build a serious alternative, progressive alternative to right-wing forces globally and regionally.
Okay. And also curious, because what is all this now connected to China? Because Pedro Sánchez of Spain has recently come back from China on that visit. He's actually been there several times in the last few years. So how does China also blend into this discussion?
Well, China has tried to play a role of being seen as more institutionally oriented, globally speaking, and responsible power in the world now that Donald Trump has done some moves that make the United States not seem something like that. And the visit by Pedro Sánchez recently to China was certainly, of course, his own initiative and Spain's need to find bilateral relations with China, but perhaps a sign of overall more warm, more openness in Europe to link up with China and perhaps not be as critical as before about China's human rights record and its lack of democracy, because Europe needs partners, and China as well as India have risen up recently as alternatives that are taken more seriously after the cooling of relations with the United States.
And do you sense that, I mean, it's not just Pedro Sánchez. I mean, it's been many European leaders on all political spectrum going to China. Is this something that is now gathering more momentum? Is it just temporary? Are they hedging their bets? How do you see all this with China?
Well, I think it's obvious that even if China's economic growth is not what it used to be, it's no longer like 10%, and they have age pyramid issues and all that, it's clear that China will continue being an increasingly important global power. And I think Europeans have decided that there's no more talk of delinking, and there's even perhaps a little bit less talk of de-risking, even though that term continues in relationship with China. And what I've seen is less emphasis on human rights conditionalities when they speak with China. Everybody, when I tell this to Finnish foreign ministry people, they say, no, we push for human rights in China as we did before. But my feeling is it happens less, because you need relationship with China in global trade. That's the perception of European leaders. Pedro Sánchez might be more upfront in going to China and speaking nicely to the Chinese, but he's by no means the only one.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, right? Because, I mean, if we look at Sanchez and the left, they've often criticized heavily war, saying no to war, being one human rights issues. But then when it comes to China, that falls silent. So this is kind of a contradiction, isn't it?
Certainly. More generally in Europe, many leaders have figured out that not only in China, but in countries influenced by China, in Africa, for example, if you go there and preach human rights and democracy and rule of law and put conditionalities on that, then the Chinese come and say, we don't put any conditionalities on you. We respect your sovereignty. So in the new scramble for Africa, where Europe is competing with China, Europeans have decided not to emphasize human rights, rule of law and democracy as much as before. So there's a more general trend in that. And of course, there are many hypocrisies and double talk and all that also on the left in Europe, as could be seen in Pedro Sanchez's actions.
Mm-hmm. And also we have in attendance Mr. Costa from the European Union, the EU Council President. What does his presence signify, if anything?
Well, there is institutionally and through Mr. Costa some presence of European institutions. And one thing that speculated around the Barcelona meetings yesterday and today is whether Pedro Sánchez, who's been figuring as a European leader, not only a Spanish leader, whether he might be willing to challenge Mr. Costa in their upcoming elections for EU Council presidency. So that has created an additional tension or thing to talk about in this Barcelona meeting going on now.
Mm-hmm. And then also the Brazilian president mentioned that AI is replacing ethics. I mean, this is also something that they want to address here at this forum. But I mean, what can realistically be achieved here, again, out of this gathering of these leaders?
Well, of course, there are several leaders of government in fairly important countries, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico. So if they put into effect into domestic politics, they can do something. But still, the organizers, Socialist International, Party of European Socialists, and the Progressive Alliance are, especially Progressive Alliance, kind of looser networks, so they don't do very binding decisions institutionally, but they can surely, outline future directions. And I think the dinner talks might be more important there than formal agreements or declarations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I also just want to get your sense briefly about the last question about Iran. I mean, we had the Strait of Hormuz open for about a day or so. Again, now from the Iranians saying it's closed once again. We've had that meeting also in Paris, about over 40 nations talking about helping together, opening that strait. So in your mind, what's next in all this? Given this summit, everything else, what are we going to see in the next few days or weeks, if anything changes?
I wish I knew, but I'm pretty sure Donald Trump is very, very willing to pack up things and leave Iran. It's not very good for him in terms of domestic politics if the conflict continues. It's difficult for him to emerge as a winner from this whole situation, but he could still downplay the damage by reaching a deal now and leaving. So that's one likely outcome, but it's complicated because Iran has taken a pretty tough stand on counter countering many things that Donald Trump has said about what will happen now, and it's unclear whether Iran might attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz again today. I certainly don't know. The fact that there's some kind of ceasefire in Lebanon certainly helps now to reach an agreement. So that was a positive sign for an agreement.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, that just has happened very recently in the last sort of hour or so, that the Iranians have said that the strait is once again in effective control of the Iranians, so effectively now being closed once again. Look, but we'll have to close that and close this discussion here. Always a pleasure speaking with you. That was Teivo Teivainen, Professor of World Politics at the University of Helsinki. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.